Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today's post is what is the craziest thing you've seen at night. Story 1. I used to live in a neighborhood with a mix of houses, townhouses, and apartments. Pretty little area with large trees and dog parks, an elementary school on one side, and walking paths, very civilized like. Except on the main path, right in the middle of this area, there was a tiny wild bit of unmaintained woods, sort of an elongated 800 square feet, some rather thick undergrowth throughout, with the path running perpendicular through it, albeit a bend in the middle, and you could still see the buildings and open path on the other side. My significant other said it was creepy, but I grew up walking around in actual woods and thought he was being silly. You could literally walk through the thing in less than 2 minutes. Went out one very early morning, using some Pokemon Go event as an excuse or motivation to exercise. Everything still had that heavy blue-gray misty cast to it, and the only noise was bird song. Went through and beyond the woodsy patch. A lady walking her dog went past me going back the way I came. Caught a few Pokemon, decided it was time for breakfast already, and headed back. No one else was on the path ahead of me or behind me. Just as I passed the bend in the thickest part of the patch, I heard several twigs snap and dead leaves crunch. Half turned my head to catch a glimpse of some woodland creature because squirrels make more noise in the undergrowth than you think. Anyways, I turned to see a large man in dark non-runner clothes taking small and fast, almost floaty steps towards me from behind some brush onto the path. Didn't even hesitate. I just immediately whipped back around and took off, mostly taking shortcuts through landscaping until I got home. I don't fuck around with that nonsense. But seriously, who the hell uses postage stamp-sized woods, more like a brush line, to hide in? He had to have been in there both when I and the other lady had walked through it. While I never heard anything about anyone else encountering this guy, I also never went out there at dawn or dusk again. Story 2. During winter in a rural no-cell service kind of area. Completely dark. No streetlights nor anyone in sight. Temperatures were around 20 and it was snowing. I was walking my dog with a flashlight. Then I heard someone start screaming bloody murder. Flight or fight kicked in. It truly sounded like someone was being stabbed to death for what seemed like forever. I chose to find out what the hell was going on. What I found instead was beyond anything I expected. He was a 5-year-old boy wandering down the road all alone. All he was wearing were light flannel pants and a thin t-shirt, no shoes or hat, and screaming so loudly it echoed through the hills. I dropped my dog's leash and walked up to him slowly, gently and repeatedly telling him that I'm a mom and that he was going to be okay. I wrapped him into my arms and carried him to a neighbor's home to warm him by the fire and call for help. Edit. The boy's parents were visiting friends. The boy got up at night to look for his parents who'd left him and his sister home while they were out drinking. He got lost in the dark and just kept walking and screaming. Originally thinking I'd get in the crosshairs or witness some bloody domestic fight is what put my mind in the scared shitless headspace. Plus dark. No cell phones, no weapon. Story 3. Holy shit, I've got one for this. Grew up in Japan. Not too small and not too big of a city. Worked a job that had me coming home daily at 2 to 4 a.m. daily. I preferred to walk the back street that paralleled the main street home because it felt more cozy and peaceful. Nothing of note happened until one day. I turned the corner onto the side street and about halfway down there was a young woman. She wasn't doing anything, just staring at the sky. Staring straight up, neck at a 90-degree angle, mouth slightly agape, long black hair hanging. I hesitated but decided that, since nothing weird has ever happened here before, it'd be fine, so I went to walk by. I get up next to her. It's a narrow road, so not a lot of room to maneuver, and pause to look at her. She hasn't moved or reacted to me. She's just staring away. So I fight my instincts and ask her if she's okay. She doesn't react. I look up to see if she's looking at something, but there's nothing there. So now I'm thinking there's something medical going on, so I reach out and touch her on the shoulder. She jolts and looks at me like she's just noticed me. I ask if she's okay and she just stammers and says sorry before hustling down the street the same way I was headed. I decided to smoke a cigarette to let some distance get between me and her, but towards the end of the street, she stops and stares at the sky again. Doesn't move for the whole 5 minutes it takes for me to finish my cig. I walked down the main street for the next couple nights. Story 4. I worked night shift for 7 years. One night a young, thin blonde woman was walking down the street at 2 a.m. with no pants or underwear on and a button-up shirt open. I tried to ask if she needed help and she just stared forward, slowly walking, staring forward. I called the police and they came and stood in front of her and she slowly walked into the cop's hand and stopped. I didn't stay and went back to work. I still think about her and what the fuck was going on. I tell myself it was sleepwalking on Ambien or something, and that she wasn't just assaulted and in complete shock. I'll never know. But she was very pretty and seemed well-groomed. Was very strange. Story 5. One time I was walking around my relatively safe neighborhood with 2 of my friends after midnight. We were probably 16 at the time. This loud red truck speeds by us, which is normal for the road we were on. Then a few minutes later the same red truck drives by the opposite way going much slower. Again just a couple of minutes later he drives by but this time stops 100 or so feet away from us and just sits there. Realizing that this is not normal, we booked it through the yard to the next street over. For the next 20 or so minutes we see this truck creeping up and down the neighborhood while we hid behind some bushes. When we finally thought he was gone, we booked it to my house. He turned the corner onto my road just as we were about to open my front door. Story 6. I worked the night shift on Kadena Ave in Okinawa, Japan. I started walking to work because I didn't have a car. I really enjoyed the walks. It was a good way to wind down after work as the nights were cool and quiet and I could listen to my music without worrying about anyone else around. One night while walking home I heard some rustling in the jungle of trees on the way home. Next thing I know all of the lights went black and all I heard and felt was a loud whoosh coming right at my head. I screamed like a little girl, ran, and dropped my iPod which broke. Once I made it past the trees I realized it was one of the giant bats that lived on Okinawa. It scared the ever-living shit out of me. Story 7. I was walking home fairly drunk from a late-night party and found a girl that had slit her wrists in the park by my house. She was on the ground by a bench. Assuming she was drunk, I stopped to see if she was okay, then I saw the blood. She was unresponsive but still alive. At first I thought she had been beaten or stabbed, but while I was on the phone with 911 I realized it was her wrists. Her face was messed up too, but I think that was from falling off the bench. EMT and police showed up, asked me a few questions, took my info, and sent me home. I never heard anything, so I assume she lived. Scariest night of my life. Story 8. Almost 100% sure I witnessed a kidnapping. I was going to get my mail late at night while living in an apartment complex, and on the way back I noticed a woman in her pajamas surrounded by a few men right by a car. There was an argument and looked like they forced her into the car and drove off. I found her slipper nearby on the grass. I of course called the police and they came and I let them know what I saw, but I never found out what actually happened. Story 9. Was out for a late walk in the rain. Always enjoy it because it's peaceful, smells great, quiet, and never see anyone. Walked off this trail back into the road and saw a big pile of garbage under a tarp at the end of the cul-de-sac the trail ends in. I got a creepy chill like that could be a dead body or something, and I'd never know that snapped me out of my calm walk. Picked up the pace. About 500 yards away, parked car with a guy sitting there. In the dark, in the rain, like 11 p.m. car off, just sitting there. Got super creeped out at this point and changed my route back to the main road and hurried home. Turns out it was a dead body someone had dumped under that tarp. Was under there for 4 days before someone investigated it. The guy in the car turned out to be just a random dude. The guy lives there and totally unrelated to the body. Still, took a few months off from my late night walks alone in the woods. Story 10. I've never been afraid of the dark. Grew up in the countryside, where the nearest streetlight was 10 miles away, so I'm comfortable in dark places, so much so that I often take my dog for a walk at around midnight just because I like the peace and quiet of the night. I live in a city now, so something about the dark is just soothing to me. That being said, one of the scariest things I've ever experienced, I genuinely have no explanation for. Living in a city, I used to drive out 20 to 30 miles into the country to do some astrophotography. As I'm driving out one night, I see this guy walking at the side of the road with no lights, reflectors, and a big backpack. Didn't think much of it other than it being a little odd. 5 miles later, I see the same guy walking again. I haven't changed directions or turned, and I've been doing 50 miles per hour. As I drove past, he looked and waved at me. I was pretty spooked, but I drove on. I must be imagining things. It can't be the same guy. I get to my field in the middle of nowhere, park up and get the camera out, and turn off all the lights so my eyes adjust to the dark. All is going well. And for 30 minutes I'm content and starting to relax. Suddenly I hear a rustling near the hedge by the road. Crunching leaves, grass being kicked. It was footsteps. I immediately get a feeling of dread, like I'm in severe danger and something bad was going to happen. I grab my camera, toss it in the car, get in, lock the doors, and turn on the headlights. When I turn out of the field, I pass where I heard the noise and saw fresh footprints in the mud, but no sign of anyone. I race back home, driving double the speed limit, constantly checking my mirrors for anyone. I park up around the corner and wait in the car with the lights off for 30 minutes, watching. Nothing shows up. I get home, lock all the doors, and sleep with a knife under my pillow that night. I honestly don't know what really happened that night, but part of me knows that creepy guy I passed on the road twice was in that field. Story 11. More backpacking than a walk, but this fucking terrifies me to this day. Our planned camping spot for the night was full. We'd backpacked all day to get to that location, and there wasn't anywhere close to set up our tents. We called our guy on the outside to come to pick us up as it was getting late. We didn't have anywhere to set up camp, and a storm was approaching. We hiked to the nearest exit point on the trail, met our pickup guy, and he drove us a few miles to the nearest campsite we were familiar with that we could basically drive up to. long logging path pretty deep in the mountains that we had hiked to in previous years, so we were kind of familiar with the area. Anyways, we hop out of the van and it's pitch black out. No moon, it's April in the mountains and still pretty chilly. We're cold, hungry, and exhausted. That's when we notice this motherfucker staring at us from behind a tree. I know this sounds like a no-sleep story, but it's 100% true and probably the most scared I've ever been. We notice this guy, no headlamp, no equipment, no backpack, just standing there. One of our group members who was a former Marine yells at him to come out and explain what his deal is. This guy walks a few feet out from behind the tree and we all shine our lights on him. And I shit you not, this dude's white t-shirt is covered in what looks like blood smears. He's pretty rough looking. Long hair, long beard, crazy eyes, and he was wearing a possibly bloody t-shirt and shorts in 35-degree weather at night. We're all pretty freaked out. And this is a pretty experienced group of hikers who've seen some shit. We ask this guy what his deal is and he says we can't camp here. We tell him that that's exactly what we plan to do. And he says I don't think that's a good idea for any of you. We kind of turn to discuss as a group and when we look back he's hidden back behind the tree. As a group we basically decided none of us were getting any sleep that night if we stayed here, so we packed up the van and left. As we were pulling out, this guy pulled out one of those red filtered flashlights and ran after our van. I'm not kidding, he followed us for at least a quarter mile on foot. He was fast as fuck. We passed a park ranger on the road and flagged him down to tell him how weird that dude was acting, and he said he'd go investigate. I didn't hear anything about it again for 5 years. For the longest time, I thought he was probably some pot farmer who had a nearby plot, or a moonshiner who was just living in the woods and didn't want us near his still. People hunt all the time out there, which would maybe explain the blood a little bit. But I was recently at an event with some of those guys again for the first time in years, and that creepy dude from the woods got brought up. One of them who still lives nearby broke out his phone and said, I forgot to tell you guys, I saw him again. Pulls up a news article and there he was. So obviously the same guy. He'd been arrested for murdering some poor girl on the trail. Timelines didn't match up, so I fully believe we saw this guy shortly after he'd murdered someone else. He hasn't been charged with anything else as far as I'm aware. I'm not backpacking without a gun anymore. Story 12. One of my old professors was a Florida wildlife officer. He would oftentimes be the only officer within a 10 to 15 mile radius in the middle of the Everglades. He had some wild stories of shit that he had seen, but the one that stuck out to me the most was when he told us about a time that he saw a truck on a road where it shouldn't have been and let the guy off with a warning. He was somewhat new to the force and decided that he didn't want to harass some guy fishing, so he let him go. A few hours later, he saw the naked body of a woman in her early 20s further down the road. He contacted state and county law enforcement with a description of the guy and the tag numbers. The vehicle was found in Orlando months later abandoned, and the owner was the dead lady they found in the Everglades. They never caught the guy driving the truck. The truck had not been reported as stolen and the lady was not reported as missing. He said he felt an immense amount of guilt after that because he was trying to be a cool cop and didn't ask the guy for ID or registration or anything, just told him he can't be fishing there at that time and let him go on his way. Story 13. Many years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a late-night walk around his generally safe neighborhood. We got a few steps past the driveway when a shirtless guy came running over with a hammer in one hand and a machete in the other. My boyfriend stayed super calm and asked the man what was going on. Apparently, some man had just broken into his apartment and tried to kidnap his young daughter. So he was chasing him down to either shatter his fingers with the hammer or chop off his hands entirely with the machete. And he thought my boyfriend was possibly this man. My boyfriend gave me his car keys and told me to take myself home. We lived apart at the time. So I went and got his car, and by the time I was backing out of the driveway, the man was screaming at my boyfriend, who was just standing there calmly with his hands in the air. I drove a block away so the man wouldn't see me, rolled the windows down to try to hear what was happening, and called the cops. The machete man ended up running off, and I don't know if they ever got him. My boyfriend was fine though, thank God. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.